Thank you again, Governor Walz, and thank you, Nick and Sheena, for your investment in justice. If anyone in the audience wants to invest in data-driven justice, please visit our website at MNJRC.org. My name is Gina Evans, and I have the honor of serving on the board of Minnesota Justice Research Center. Two of our sponsors today are Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge, who provides drug and alcohol treatment for teens and adults and is often an alternative to incarceration, where I serve as the advocacy director, and Minnesota Second Chance Coalition that provides training, mobilization, and legislative outreach for those impacted by or working within the criminal justice system. Thank you to these sponsors who continue to work toward a better future for others. As a formerly incarcerated person myself who has served 4 years behind bars, I am so grateful to be doing this work. One of the cool things about this work is it can and should be work that unifies us, left and right. Today, we have a panel of amazing people with amazing ideas about the work of reform. Chair Carlos Mariani, Janae Bates, Chaz Anderson, and Mitch Pearlstein. Thank you for being with us today. Please, each of you take a moment to introduce yourself and then 4 to 6 minutes to respond to Governor Walz's comments. And if possible, please share with us policies you believe the legislature could work together on in 2021 to bring the shared value of safety for all Minnesotans.
Gina, I don't think we can start the video. We have a sign here, at least I do. It says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Mitch will address that. Maybe Chaz, you get started, and then Mitch will fix that issue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. I appreciate your invitation and the Minnesota Justice Research Center's invitation to join this really esteemed panel. My name is Chaz Anderson. I have worked in and around the state capitol for the last 20 years for 2 governors and 2 times at the Minnesota House of Representatives. And right now I'm here representing the Justice Action Network. That is a national organization committed to criminal justice reform, working in 20 states and at the federal level. Minnesota, we're proud to say Minnesota is one of those 20 states that we have been working in for the past 5 years. We have worked on legislation from drug sentencing reform in 2016 to forfeiture reform, driver's license suspension reform, and many other issues, and will continue to do so. You know, Gina, you asked me to respond, you know, kind of to, or asked all the panel to respond to remarks from Governor Walz. And having, you know, worked around the Capitol, I think the great thing about our issue and the governor's remarks is that this is a priority for him. And if you have a governor who's putting these issues forward, making it a priority, that makes your hill to climb at the legislature a little more friendly than a governor that's not necessarily interested in reform. So the good news is we have a governor who is committed to working on these issues and reforming and working with the legislature. And so that's very important. That's not to say our challenge at the legislature isn't there. We have a divided legislature. We're, again, the only legislative chamber in the nation that is divided between political parties, and that will continue forward in the next 2 years again. But it also presents an opportunity to find ways that we can work together on criminal justice reform. And a lot of these reforms do have bipartisan support. One important partner we have at the Capitol is Americans for Prosperity, which is a center-right organization that's been committed to reform for many, many years and continues to do so. And so I think this is the one issue where really you can truly say you have a lot of groups on the right and left that are working together to push forward with reform. But, you know, we also, you know, want to see and need to see greater action, quicker action than what we've seen in the last few years. And so we look forward to working on those issues with Governor Walz, and happy that he's making this issue a priority for the session.
Someone else want to introduce themselves and comment?
Want me to jump in?
Thanks, Mitch.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the invite. I'm Mitch Pearlstein. I'm the founder emeritus, meaning I'm retired from Center of the American Experiment. And I led that organization, which is a conservative and free market think tank, for 25 years up until about 5 years ago. I have a background in government, journalism, and education. If someone were to ask me to describe what I do in one word, I'm a writer. And I've spent a lot of time in recent years writing about family fragmentation and looking for ways for kids, young people to do well in this life without necessarily getting a 4-year degree. I agree with just about everything I've heard this morning. I haven't heard everything. I tuned into Mayor Fry's remarks, I think just a few moments after he started, and I had no reason to disagree with him on anything, actually agreed. Where the governor is concerned, I should go back to Mark Levin, who I was on the same page with throughout, and I've known Mark for quite a while. And where the governor is concerned, I certainly appreciate and agree with his passion. Can't say that I agreed with every detail, but I certainly concurred with most. By way of prologue as well, I'm on the board of the Redemption Project, a nonprofit that many of you know about in the Twin Cities, meaning I believe deeply in redemption. I've always viewed this country, well, let me put it this way. This country is often described as a land of opportunity, which it is, though I have long been of the mind that a better way of describing that is that we're a country of second and third chances. And one can make the argument that some people have more chances than others. I certainly would agree with that, and we need to do what we can do to rectify that. But I believe in redemption, and that is one area where we can make progress, one would hope, in the legislature and elsewhere. But while I agree with much of what I have heard this morning, my problem has less to do with explicitly what I have heard and has more to do with omission, what I have not heard. I'm of the mind that culture matters a lot, and I'm sure other people agree with me. I'm also of the mind that policy means a lot, but I also see the limitations of policy perhaps more vividly than many do, particularly in education, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the sad fact of the matter is that little or not nearly enough will improve unless crime rates simply go down significantly. They will not improve. We will not do a whole bunch better so long as so many kids come into this life without living under the same roof with both of their parents. We know this. The research is so clear. Common sense is so clear. And family fragmentation rates in Minnesota, particularly Minneapolis and in St. Paul, are some of the highest in the country, making what we need to do so much more difficult. And then there is education. Yes, we have had and have terrible achievement gaps, but we have been talking about this for decades, and we have been seeking policy solutions for decades. And to say now we have to get serious, that's silly. We've been serious all this time. We have to have more kids take their education seriously, regardless of what their teachers do, to be perfectly blunt, or administrators do. We have an obligation as young people and as old people to work as hard as we can. And that is simply not happening now, not nearly enough kids graduating. If we do, last point, if we do want to seek a policy change in education that will make, without question, make a difference for many kids, not all, We need to expand educational freedom in Minnesota. There is no doubt whatsoever that many kids do better in private and parochial schools than they do in public schools. But the leadership, the political leadership in Minnesota is as intransigent as about any in the United States about expanding educational choices, particularly for low-income kids and kids of color. And if we were to overcome that policy problem, we would make some progress. Thanks very much.
Chair Mariana, would you like to go next?
Sure. Good morning, Gina. The Minnesota Justice Resource Center for this opportunity. I attended the last conference, and it was rich and powerful and full of energy, and it was incredibly diverse with folks from different political communities as well as different social communities. And it seems to me that that's a powerful, important recipe for driving change in our society. So I know there's a lot of talk of how our society is divided now. I think there's incredible unity in our society, even in the midst of great disagreements over formal political leadership decision making. Let me just say, I'll try to be really quick. 4 points, and then I'll provide a couple of points in response to the governor, which was what we were asked to do right away here. One is that, from my perspective, I think that public safety and criminal justice is something that should unite all of us across society. All human beings have a fundamental desire to be safe. All human beings have a fundamental desire to be part of a functional, reinforcing of that person's sense of being healthy community. And so public safety and criminal justice reform, in my belief, is something that ought to unite us and is something that ought to be constantly focused on how to build stronger communities. It's such a fundamentally important function that we recognize it in our nation as a core governmental function. And when government can't provide it, when government can't be part of working as a tool for its citizens to provide it, then our society breaks down and we get the opposite of public safety, and we get the opposite of justice out of our criminal justice system. So here's the thing, in a democratic society, that means that there has to be safety and justice for each and all of us. That includes, that should have been there for George Floyd, for Philando Castile, for Breonna Taylor, and so many others. If it's not there, there is no public safety. There's only subjective enforcement of laws. And that means that citizens then lose respect for the law, and you begin to have the breakdown of the necessary contact for us to have a decent society. Second point is that there is a temptation. Believe me, I'm a politician, I get this. There is a temptation for politicians to use that basic concern, desire that we all have for safety as a weapon to stoke fear and to divide us. There's also the possibility for politicians to use it to unite us. It's a matter of choice, and it's a matter of how our decisions get reinforced and supported by the general populace. Leadership matters, it always does. And I submit to you what we need then is leadership in the political arena that pushes beyond the politics of division. I think that's what the governor was trying to frame this morning. And I think it's what Chaz alluded to earlier when she mentioned the existence of both left and right in a movement for criminal justice reform. The other point is that safety requires different things. It requires the use of different tools. Punishment and enforcement are valid tools, but they're only one set of tools. We need to use tools that complement that work with that are different. Someone earlier, I think, mentioned restorative justice approaches. And again, keep in mind, this is about building a community. And so we need broader toolboxes. We need a broader toolbox with a diversity of tools to be able to problem solve in a community, because when crime happens, that's what it is. There's a problem that needs to be solved. And so criminal justice and public safety need to go hand in hand with the understanding, with the centeredness that that those engaged in it should be engaged in building community. As to the governor's comments earlier today, I'll just lift up two things really quickly, and then I'll stop. One is I heard in the governor's comments a call for more action. He rightfully identified our work this year, this summer, to pass the Minnesota Police Accountability Act of 2020. And many of you know that the bill that was passed in the House was a broader bill that involved a number of different tools. And much of that was lost along the way as we negotiated out with the Senate to have a bill for the governor to sign. It's a good bill, but the governor is acknowledging that there's more that needs to be done. In my opinion, there needs to be more around accountability, accountability that has action to it, that involves transparent decision-making, particularly in guiding the conduct of our state licensed, because that's what they are, state licensed public servants who are peace officers, and also to hold them to account when they commit wrong. There has to be work, and Mitch speaks to this, on impacting culture. There is a culture within all our professions, and there is a culture, a dominant culture, I believe, in the policing profession that is often incredibly unhealthy. And like so much of other cultural aspects of our society, is rife with, at the very least, misunderstandings that people have across race and ethnicity, at the very worst, downright racial hostility and enmity that makes it easy to do harm to someone outside of your own racial group. And then I think the other more is how do we consistently connect the dots across the different endeavors of our society, public safety, with education, with employment, with human rights, with the development of a just economy, all those things. And the governor spoke a bit to this. I think Mitch also referred to this, that there is an agenda before us to constantly see how the dots, if you will, of our society are connected with one another, so that we can leverage those for the sake of a consensus on what our core values are. And then the second observation, and I'll stop with this, with the governor's comments, is that he places in that reimagining, in that redesign, at the center of it, and I just spoke about it, an attention to racial equity. Everyone knows, well, I shouldn't speak for everyone, you know. I know that it wasn't an accident that George Floyd was a Black man and was killed by police officers. It's happened before. It happens repeatedly. It statistically happens in a wildly disproportionate reality. And so therefore, like so many things before us, we need to engage this conversation by placing racial equity as a solution at the center of it, and understanding the role that racism that we've inherited and that we continue to perpetuate, quite frankly, in our society, how it impacts us. Incredibly uncomfortable, incredibly difficult, in many ways more questions than there are answers. But unless we engage in any design, constant designing, redesigning of our society without the reality of racism at the center of those explorations and design work, we're only going to continue to perpetuate the inequalities that created the horrible event that fateful evening in May earlier this year. So thank you all. I look forward to continued conversation here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here and for allowing me to speak. My name is Minister Gina Bates. I am the Communications Director for Isaiah, who I'm representing today. I'm also, as I mentioned, a minister and a political analyst and a narrative strategist and a theologian. And at the core, myself and Isaiah, we are about representing people, Minnesotans across the state in many, many different walks of life. So we represent over 250,000 Minnesotans in about 250 congregations, including 30 Islamic mosques, 300 small child care centers, small family-run child care centers, a few dozen Black-owned barbershops. And again, we're in the cities, suburbs, and greater Minnesota. And for decades now, we have been involved in criminal justice work, pushing for bail reform and probation reform, and working on sentencing guidelines and restoring the vote, and most certainly at every level, from our policing to our judges to our county and district attorneys, but also to the root of the issues around, so like poverty and illness and desperation. And so for me and those who I am representing, and quite honestly, for most of us on this call, I imagine, is that we have similar values, that we know that no matter what we look like or where we live, that most of us want to be whole, that we want our communities to be vibrant, that we want and know that we deserve to have safe communities. And we also know that we have faced a lot of realities that have violated those values egregiously. And so we know that the people that we have entrusted to serve and protect our communities often target, detain, and even kill Black people like George Floyd, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor's, among many, many others. And all the while, a handful of politicians have thrown out lies to divide us. And that we've seen that happen time and time again. And we know that it's because if we're made to fear each other, then we will look the other way. While police officers who are meant to uphold the law, uphold, safety in our communities, and that they don't do that. And that elected leaders who are meant to govern in our name, they'll hand millions to corporations to militarize local law enforcement and to deny resources to schools and healthcare, things we actually need, especially now amongst the pandemic, but we've always needed. We have a backlog of needs, right? And so what we saw that happened this summer was absolutely incredible. After the murder of George Floyd, we all came together. There was a reckoning that many of us felt and saw and heard as our feet marched in the streets. We came together across cities, across the suburbs, across greater Minnesota, across race, region, religion, to demand that our communities be safe, that we care for one another, and that we know that when we use our resources to pitch in and take care of each other, we can have the schools, the services, the communities that we actually need, so that we're not constantly putting Band-Aids on bullet wounds, that we are at the root handling the issues around why we even have to have these conversations year after year around criminal justice reform. And so what we saw this summer is that we know that things that have been said, that impossible things, that we can actually make the impossible possible when we work together, when we invest in one another. We saw almost overnight the Hennepin County Jail decrease their population by 40% in the name of being safe and secure for people who are incarcerated to not have COVID. That is something that we could do in our state prisons. These are but also these are things we have been demanding and crying out for years. And then we were told it's not possible, it's not possible. And all of a sudden, oh, it is. And so what the whole point and purpose, right, of all of this idea of that we want to reform, we want to recreate, reimagine, it's really at its core about recognizing that we're all human beings, that all of us have incredible capability of love. We have incredible capability of redemption and reconciliation, and that we need to continue to give each other opportunities to live into that. And when we throw people in cages, when we allow police and a handful of people to divide us based on what we look like, what language we speak, where we come from, or how much or little money we have, right? We know that that is strategic. That has been a years-long, decades-long, centuries-long plan in order to make our government not be our government, to make it teeny tiny and drown it in a bathtub, to make us fear each other so that we don't actually want to invest in one another, and key, to get those who have been dodging out and not using their resources that they have been extracting from us for a very long time and been making hand over fist money while we struggle, especially during a pandemic, so that we don't get them to pay their fair share. Because then we can have all the things we need that actually create safe communities, and that we don't have to keep having these cyclical conversations about how do we properly put people in cages? How do we properly punish people for a system that was never created to work for them? We should actually be saying, how do we unrig the rules so that each and every one of us can fully live into the dignity and humanity and justice that we all deserve? And so I love that Governor Walz lifted up a lot of the granular ideas about this. I would like to add that, our House members in the last session, they put forth a pretty good start. I'll be clear, it was a good start with their plan around policing and creating safe communities. It also got drastically watered down once Senate leadership got a hold of it. And so I think this legislative session, even though we have a divided legislature, that does not mean we have a divided government, because again, being clear, government is we the people. And so we the people have the same basic needs that all human beings have, which means all of our leadership should be leaning into that completely and totally, being completely centered on people. And if they're going to be people centered in a budget year, knowing that our budget is a moral document that says how we care for each other and how we decide who's deserving and who isn't, we instead will not let a handful of people say this person is deserving and this one isn't, and we're going to cut all of their things. No. In the midst of a pandemic, this is time when we need to invest. This is when we need to raise the revenue to make sure that we can care for each other now and create that future that we all know is possible. We've seen glimmers of it. So we need to fully lean in. And I know that Mitch mentioned that, we always talk about this, right? But we say, oh, we're going to get serious. The thing that makes it serious is when we say we're going to put the resources behind it and make it happen, which we have never done, because we've let too many people divide us based on a bunch of silly things, right? And that's put us in a position where we keep divesting. And then we end up here and cry about how we got here, but we know how to get out. Thank you.
Thank you, Janae. And thank all of you for your comments and for the work that you're doing to get to a place where we can get to criminal justice reform. The next question that I have really speaks to all of your comments, and what do you see as the mission of the criminal justice system? And is that system delivering what Minnesotans expect from it? Chair Mariani, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you, Gina. I see the mission of our criminal justice system. I should probably put on my, start my video here. Okay, there we go. I believe the mission of our criminal justice system is to help build and maintain healthy communities, as I shared earlier. And in my mind, those are communities that reflect and strengthen our civilization's commitment to human dignity, to human rights, and to opportunities for each and all of us. I think that's really the American, the American experiment, if you will. When I became the chairperson of the Minnesota House Public Safety Criminal Justice Reform Committee, we adopted the framework of a community-centered public safety. It was good to hear the governor use that frame in his comments. And we adopted it to acknowledge that it takes all parts of a community to guide how its members can interact with one another in a way that builds positive relationships to prevent crimes in the first place. And in the event that crimes occur, because in human societies, that's gonna happen, to then together problem solve in order to mend the community. And so it's, again, I keep coming back with the same mission focus about building, strengthening community, and often that requires mending and healing communities. So the idea is really pretty simple for me. Community building and problem solving takes the whole community, and not just police officers, nor just those who serve in the formal justice system. And that there's a mending that needs to be a part of that. And you can't mend when the only tool that you use is to punish people. And again, I'm not putting punishment off the table. That's a part of the human condition. But if that's the only thing on the table, we're not going to be mending communities, which means we're going to be weakening communities. I think that Minnesotans, as I said earlier, have a strong expectation to be safe, but they also expect to prosper. Minnesotans want a prosperous state. They want prosperous communities. And prospering is difficult to do when a community is not healed. You need a healthy community within which to prosper. And in terms of whether our criminal justice system is delivering on that expectation of safety and prosperity, I do think that our criminal justice system is falling short in a number of areas, particularly, and no doubt we'll talk about more specifics as we go along, but particularly in early intervention efforts to help prevent crimes, and as I mentioned earlier, to alternatives to incarceration that can actually strengthen and help individuals become whole so that they can be part of building communities. So, so again, I'll stop there, but the mission of our public safety and criminal justice system, absolutely, it's about promoting the public safety, but we have to understand what that means is it means it's about building community.
Jazz, do you want to weigh in?
Gina, I'm unable to actually use my video. It says that you haven't, me not able to use my video. So I don't know if you want to just go to Janae and then we can fix that.
Yeah, I don't mind speaking. So it was, what do I see as the mission of the criminal justice system? And if Minnesota is meeting that. I think that the mission of I actually think it's important to kind of go back to this idea of it being a system, right? Because we talk a lot about systems in general that they feel like these big machines that are like moving and complex and complicated, and they are. But at its core, it's a series of decisions that we make. We make them, our lawmakers, our leaders, the people we elect make them. But we make them as human beings, decisions over and over and over again, and we make different ones sometimes. And that's what builds these systems. And so the system of criminal justice, at its core, we should be leaning way more into this idea of justice, right? But it is, as Rep. Mariani mentioned, it is about creating that space for people to have safe communities, to be in relationship with one another, in right relationship with one another, and when harm occurs, because just as humans are beings where we have faults, and we make errors, when harm occurs, that there is a way to bring about reconciliation. There is a way to bring restoration. How do we restore these parties, both the offender and the offended? How do we get people to a place of wholeness? That is what our choices, that's what our North Star around the choices we make should be for our criminal justice system. Is that what we see in Minnesota? Unfortunately, no. I mean, but quite frankly, we know we don't actually see that anywhere right now. But as Governor Walz mentioned, we're in a very particular situation where we have incredible challenges, but an immense amount of opportunity. We have the opportunity to be intentional about creating that system, about making those choices where we are putting each other in right relationship, where we can really take space to have political imagination, prophetic imagination. And that's why I really love this idea of reimagining our criminal justice system, that we don't have to lean into the same old, and hope that we get different results. That we can start to test out things. And I was in a panel earlier that talked about how we actually don't talk about the things that work very often. There are a lot of things happening across this country that are working, that are reducing crime, that are reducing violence, reducing harm. We can start to implement those things. And a lot of times that means moving our money into these proven mechanisms of safety, our healthcare spaces, our educational spaces, our public spaces where people get to become whole. So yes, I'll call my time there.
You want me to jump in, or Chaz?
I'm going to move on to the next question, just because I have a few more questions, and I want to take some questions from the audience as well. And so I'm gonna move to another question that I think that you'll want to answer, Mitch. The idea of redemption is a millennial old one. Please consider this quote by Mark Levin, founder of Right on Crime, a center-right political or public policy think tank located in Texas. While even children must be held accountable for their actions, every parent knows that children are not the same as adults. Their understanding of risk and consequences are limited, and they often have more difficulty resisting pressure from peers and adults. But every parent also knows that children have a unique capacity for positive growth and change. What is the role of government to provide opportunities for those who have made mistakes but want redemption and seek to live a productive life?
Yes, and yes. If I were to hope that jails and prisons, particularly prisons, would do anything over and above what they're doing right now, would be education and training for the people in them, because they'll be coming out. And I'm involved in a project that is doing exactly that. what society has to do is to be as open-minded and compassionate as it is appropriately tough when it comes to crime. And that bespeaks in a real fashion the politics of it all. There are carjackings going on in Minneapolis right now, an increase. I don't know if they've stopped this week, but they were significant. I wonder how many of those people stealing cars and beating up people have been in jail or prison, and they have been released. I suspect politically, there are a fair number of people, particularly in Minneapolis right now, who are not terribly open-minded about softening the system, call it that, making it more likely that offenders do not get incarcerated, or if they're incarcerated, they come out quicker than they otherwise might. Now, that might be the wisest course, but politically, every time there is a serious crime, the chances are very strong that the person committing it has a rap sheet that's pretty long. And that is not a way in which to convince people, generally speaking, that we should incarcerate less and let people out sooner rather than later. It's a balancing act, needless to say, and it's a difficult one. One last point, my appreciation to Representative Mariani for mentioning me twice and both times in kind ways. Thank you. He's an old friend.
Gina, I'll go ahead and step in if that's okay. You know, one of the things that I think surprises people is when you look at the statistics and, you know, 1 out of 3 Americans have a criminal record. And if you think about it, this is something the Brennan Center put out, as many Americans have a criminal record as they do a college degree. And so what that means is that we have now created barriers to employment, housing, higher education, because, you know, at higher education, you may not be eligible then for financial aid, you may not get into the institution. And so one of the things that I think has failed in this effort on the criminal justice system is how have we addressed alternatives to incarceration? How have we addressed rehabilitation? And if we're saying that if you serve your sentence, and then after you serve your sentence and you've done what you're supposed to do, now you can't find a job, now you can't find housing, now you can't go to higher education institution to better yourself. We've created these barriers for people to become productive citizens of our society, and we really need to change that narrative. And that is part of the whole criminal justice system, is that we can't afford as a country to have 1 out of 3 Americans not able to access employment to which then they'll pay taxes. They'll support our system. They'll support their families. They'll have access to a mortgage or housing or rental that they need. And so I really believe this is it's not only criminal justice reform, but it's an economic issue for our country that we just cannot sit by and let what's happening happen. And we need to find solutions so that, yes, what we're saying is that if you commit a crime, you have to serve your sentence. But we also need to find ways that to have avenues for people to become productive citizens. And so that we don't really have that today. It's very difficult for Minnesotans or Americans to have access to a system and to become productive citizens in the construct that we've created with our criminal justice system.
Okay, I just want to a reminder to the audience, if you guys have any questions for the panelists, you can put them in the chat. We did get one. What are the key, for anyone on the panel, what are the key barriers in building trust to creating an engaged community? And we got a similar question to that for community members that move from a more populated area into a less populated area, into like southern Minnesota. How do you engage the community? Janae, do you maybe want to take that one?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to get off mute. I'm sorry, Gina, could you repeat the first question?
Yeah, I think, I think both of the questions were a little bit different, but I think both attendees are asking about one of them was key barriers to building trust and creating an engaged community. And that was kind of the gist of both questions.
Okay, yeah. So trust is a thing that we absolutely all need in order to feel safe. It's funny that like we talk about safety a lot, and then we think safety is just no crime. And it's the same thing as like peace is not just no war. In order to actually have full shalom peace, it requires a lot more. And the same applies for safety. And so trust is definitely one of those things. Being a Black woman myself, growing up in a Black community, currently living in a multiracial community where I have Hmong neighbors and Latino neighbors and white neighbors, we have established a certain level of trust among each other. And I think, but most certainly we have a hard time when it comes to trusting unaccountable entities like police departments, for example. And I think when we're talking about our criminal justice system, we have a similar thing. We hear when someone's murdered by the police, or when someone is over-sentenced, overcharged, given 30 years probation, and we hear trust the system. It is a slap in the face to the experience and reality of what people are facing. When someone steals a car because they are incredibly poor, and that experience for them is at least going to make it possible for them to make it to the next day. To have a broad, like, throw the book at them, throw them in prison until we're and ever. And then not think about the impact that has on that individual as a human being, their family. When we're faced with these things every single day, it is hard to build trust. And so to answer the question in a solution, right, is to go back to what I've been saying from the jump, is that it is really about getting to the root of the issue. Like, we keep doing the work of the reform, but we also need to do the work of ensuring that all of these communities have the basic things that they need, so that when we're not blocking wages for going up. We have nationwide, we have the horrific issues with wage gaps. When we're talking about Blacks and whites in Minnesota, we have issues around wage gaps. And I can't just say that and let that be, because what happens is then we hear, oh, Black people have some inferiority that makes them less likely to make a better wage. And that's not actually how this works. What tends to happen is the choices that we've made in the system have rigged the rules and made it harder for Black people to have a higher wage. And so even being honest is going to help build trust in community. Being honest about why we have disparities. I hate the term, because when we just say it, again, we end up blaming the people who are hurt in it, and we don't have an honest conversation about the choices that have been made over and over and over again that perpetuate it, that keep the system hurting us. And then we continue to blame those who are hurting the worst. And let's be clear, everyone is hurting. White folks are hurting, Black folks are hurting, Indigenous people are hurting, people in greater Minnesota are hurting, people in the cities are. And what's beautiful is that the solution lies in us working together, investing in one another. When we pull up those who are hurting the most, we get pulled up too.
Gina, may I hit this from a different direction?
Yep, go ahead, Mitch. Thank you so much, Janae, for your answer. That was fabulous.
I'm very pro-police. That is not to say I subscribe to bad things police do. It's not to say I'm oblivious to rotten police cultures frequently. And it is to say that the murder of George Floyd was the most hideous thing I've ever seen. But I'm an old police reporter. My wife used to be a police chaplain. And it occurred to me a long time ago that police get to see people at their worst every single day, and it takes a toll. And to be a professional law enforcement officer, to be a professional cop, you have to overcome that. You can't take it out on people. But if we're interested in being fair and interested in building real trust, in this instance with police departments and officers, then we have to recognize the difficult jobs that they have. And when it comes to incarceration rates that are higher in some communities than others, that has to do, frankly, with the fact that there's more crime in those areas, and there will be more encounters between police and the people in those communities. Not a justification for violence, not a justification for anything bad, but it would be a good idea if we all appreciated what's going on here.
Thanks, Mitch. We have a great question from the audience for any of you. What are a few things that a person can do to advance equitable outcomes in the criminal justice system? We haven't heard a ton from Chaz. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take it from a public policy perspective. One of the things that in 2016 that was very eye-opening for me was when we were working on drug sentencing legislation that was successfully passed through the House and Senate and signed by Governor Dayton, was that we had the Sentencing Guidelines Commission do a racial impact study or statement on the changes we were making to drug sentencing laws. And we were able to see what impact our changes would have on communities across Minnesota. And I've never really seen that with any other legislation done where we basically have a racial impact statement. And I thought to myself, what if we did that on every piece of legislation, tough on crime, reform minded, it doesn't matter, that we actually, instead of just looking at the fiscal impact, which the legislature always does, that we looked at also the racial impact of that legislation. And I'm just wondering if that, change, I know it's a small change to make, but in the public policy arena, to put that in front of legislators and say, here's the impact of your legislation will have on communities, as well as the fiscal impact. I think that would be powerful. And I would kind of throw that to Representative Mariani because he's a policymaker and decision maker as chair. But I thought that was very eye-opening when we did that. Conducted that study on the drug sentencing reform changes and would think that it would be helpful in looking at legislation.
Yeah, I really like that idea. And there are variations of that that have moved around the legislature in the last few years. And I know in some of my conversations with the Posse caucus members of late, there continues to be renewed interest in pursuing development of those kind of tools that allow us to use different lenses by which we make public policy decisions. It firmly puts real people at the center of analyzing what the impact of our decisions. So that's the way to think about it, and obviously to think about it, given the racial realities that we have in our society. I would add on a personal level, in terms of what the individual can do, to Gina's question, there's several things. One is, study racism and don't do it by yourself, do it with others. It's a social phenomena. And it needs to be deconstructed and understood in terms of how we interact with one another. So that part of that reflection needs to be in interaction with others. Definitely, with folks in your affinity group, if you will, but also in diverse settings. That's going to lead you, hopefully, to committing yourself to personal change. Before you even attempt to make systemic structural change. How do I choose to make decisions differently and structure my life differently as a result of it? And then move to the systems, study the design and the structure of our current criminal justice system, and its relationships to all the other aspects of our society. Another thing, this is going to sound odd coming from a legislator, don't assume legislation is the only pathway to change. You know, it's not atypical for me to have lobbyists, advocates, regular citizens come up to the state office building and propose a piece of legislation to address something that is important. It should be addressed. And often, what the goal, frankly, could be additionally met, not just by passing legislation. Hey, listen, making laws isn't easy. I've never been the author of a simple bill. Chaz is smiling because she knows what I'm talking about. The simplest bills are often the quote unquote simplest are often the most incredibly difficult bills to pass. You know, our system is designed that way for a purpose. You know, laws are not frivolous. You know, the rules that govern and provide structure for our society, quite frankly, shouldn't be easily, you know, simply, you know, constructed, even though there may be simple ideas, and especially in a society where it's democratic, where we're going to have differences of opinions. And so all that by way of saying is that if your strategy for affecting change in the criminal justice system only lies through passing legislation, you're setting yourself up and you're setting that mission up for a great disappointment. So what does that mean? Study the system, learn the levers within our criminal justice system. Who makes decisions? What rules govern those decisions? What processes are being followed for policy and implementation? And then use them, engage in them in order to drive different decisions within the system. You know, a couple of years ago, the Minnesota sentencing, well, a little over a year ago, Minnesota sentencing guidelines took a huge step to change the terms of the length of terms of our probation sentences in our state, really aligning it along with social science for some of the best practices. Basically, simply, you know, acknowledging that putting someone on probation for 20, 30 years is just not an effective approach to criminal justice reform, community building. Would I have preferred that we had done that through legislation, because we could have? Well, we tried, and you know, there's real differences of opinions on why that didn't happen. But while we were stuck, not deciding at the legislature, people's lives were being incredibly negatively hurt. All sorts of avenues for participating in society were being shut down, as Chaz framed up earlier. And so the Sentencing Guidelines Commission, within its authority, then made that decision. So that wasn't legislation, you know, that was administrative decision-making within rules, within rulemaking in our legal system that made that happen. And that required all sorts of citizens engaging with that body at the same time that they were engaging with me to try to pass legislation. And then the final step is to do that collectively. Don't try to do that by yourself. The final step is to engage the public in shaping the vision. Mental mindsets matter. Mitch referred to that earlier when he talked about, you know, people with long rap sheets. You know, for me, that tells me that something's not working, you know, and probably it's that we're just simply incarcerating people over and over again, and that's not working. That makes sense. It doesn't make sense to the general public. And so we've got to be able to engage with the general public in such a way so that we can reveal and shine a light on alternative ways that have efficacy in terms of their outcomes. So engaging public and the public narrative is critically important.
Well, that wraps up our time. I think that's a great note to kind of end on what the ways that we can really have an impact on the criminal justice system. And we had some additional questions, but if people want to engage, they can go to the website www.mnjrc.org and look at that or donate. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and for being willing to come and talk about the work that you do and your ideas about reform. And we just really appreciate all of you. And thank you, Chair Mariani and Mitch and Chaz and Janae. All of you are just doing such great work and we appreciate you. I think now everybody's supposed to go back to the main room. I don't even know, but thank you guys so much.